Hello viewers, welcome to London Lights. We're going to start tonight's program with a quiz for you Londoners. And I'm hoping you can figure out who we're talking about tonight. Here's the quiz. Which resident of London, Ontario hosted Winston Spencer Churchill at his London, Ontario home, Headley, for an overnight stay? Which Londoner is considered by some historians to be Canada's greatest public servant? A man who in 25 years of public life is considered without compare. A man who considered himself a servant of the people. Which Londoner dominated Ontario politics for over 20 years? Which Londoner served as both mayor of the City of London and as a member of the provincial parliament, both at the same time? Which Londoner founded and built a hospital to treat tuberculosis patients on Sanatorium Road in London? And which Londoner was knighted by a British king? Which Londoner introduced cheap, reliable electricity to the City of London and was the brainchild behind publicly owned hydro in the province of Ontario? And finally, which Londoner had a high school in London named after him? My guest this evening is Dan Brock, a local London historian. Dan, who are we talking about?
It can't be anybody else but Sir Adam Beck.
Right. The late, the great Sir Adam Beck, perhaps one of London's brightest London lights. I think in the pre-interview, Dan, I was explaining to you that sometimes when I prepare for these programs, I feel a heavy weight on my shoulders. I feel a responsibility to try and do justice to some of these great Londoners that may be fading from our memories. We don't want that to happen, and Sir Adam Beck is certainly one that we need to remember and consider his influence. So Dan, tell me, who was Sir Adam Beck?
Well, first of all, I would say that, I would not be surprised if there's people in London who have never heard of Sir Adam Beck, and yet he probably is one of the most influential people in London and in Ontario in the 20th century, without a doubt. The contribution he made both to the city and to the province and even beyond is immeasurable. And the more I read about him, the more I realize just exactly what he has done and how comparatively, in a way, he might be underappreciated.
Well, I think you're right, Dan. I spoke to a young London lawyer as I was preparing for the show, telling him I was going to be doing a program on Sir Adam Beck. And he said, who? Now, this is a London lawyer we're talking about here. And he said, how do you pick these obscure people? I almost fell over, but needless to say, there's a need for us to talk about this great individual and his influence on London, Ontario, and Canada. So how did he get his start? Who was Sir Adam Beck? I know he was born in 1857, so we were still 10 years from being a country at that point in time. But how did he rise to fame, and how did he have such influence in this area?
Well, okay, that's quite a bit in itself. But anyway, he was born of German immigrants in Baden, Ontario, what is now Ontario, which is to the west of Kitchener. He had a somewhat meager formal education. He started working quite early in his father's foundry there in Baden. And then when the father was having economic problems and so on like that, he went and worked for a brass foundry in Toronto. In about 1879, he borrowed $500. Now, $500 back then would be something like about $1,500 today. And with his brother William, they set up a foundry in Galt. And what they were doing was making veneer cigar boxes and things like that out of wood. Cigar boxes, of course, this is before you had the sort of the pressed cardboard ones of later that we're familiar with. Okay, so they were made out of a thin veneer of wood at that particular time. Well, they worked there for about 4 years, and then they decided to move to London, because London at that time was really the capital, certainly for Ontario or Upper Canada. Well, it would be Ontario by that time. It was the capital for the cigar manufacturing in Canada.
Dan, people may be surprised to hear that at one time London had a very thriving cigar making business.
Yes, we are talking about over 1 million cigars being made a year, and maybe around 14 or so different cigar companies. So there certainly was a market for cigar boxes in London, and that's why he moved here. One of the things I should point out about him, because this is characteristic of Beck throughout his life, no one worked harder than him. He didn't mind rolling up his sleeves, and this is throughout his life. Even though he's dressed up and everything else, he's quite prepared to slough off what he has, put on coveralls, and try and fix things if he finds things that are needing repair in the electric generators, just like he did with his factory. I mean, he would get up before dawn, and he would be working before the workers came in. He'd sharpen the saws for them. He even slept. He had a room and slept at the factory itself. And he was known to go and hand deliver the orders himself, pushing a two-wheeled hand cart. So he certainly was, a very industrious person. And this other characteristic we see is that he was one of the men. Okay, he very much related with the workman, and they certainly saw that in him and appreciated that in him. We see this throughout his life.
Okay, Dan, so would it be fair to say that he became a very successful businessman? He moved his business to London. He had a thriving business here. And people recognized him for his industriousness, his success, and he became a very influential person on the local London scene. Is that fair?
Definitely. And I might point out that his industriousness came from his father, but his sense of community and sense of looking out for others, particularly the downtrodden, if you will, or the poor people. I think he got that from his mother, and later also from his wife.
So it only made sense at that point that he started considering politics, maybe as a way to serve the people of London and Ontario. And I understand that he got involved in politics. In 1898, he ran for the Ontario legislature. But like a lot of politicians, including myself, he lost the first time.
That's certainly correct, yeah.
But he didn't give up. And in 1902, he was elected mayor.
Yes, and the interesting thing is he had no political experience before that. He wasn't an alderman. An alderman back then would be like the councillors today. He went right fresh from his business and got elected. That just shows how popular he was in London, how well known he was, and how much people trusted him.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. He runs for the top job, and he became mayor in 1902. Now, what I really found fascinating, this doesn't happen any longer, but he served both as mayor, and then he was successful in getting elected to the Ontario legislature. So he really wore two political hats for a significant period of time, didn't he?
That's correct, and that was he was elected to the provincial legislature just a few months after he became mayor, and we see this earlier with Sir John Carling. He was both the representative for Canada West, which is now Southern Ontario, and for Canada itself. I guess it should be Ontario because we're representing both of them. So he was both an MP and an MPP at one and the same time. You could do that back then, just like Beck could be both mayor and MPP at one and the same time.
He's a rising star on the London scene and in Ontario. Let's talk about his home. And I'm very fascinated about his home because one of my heroes, Sir Winston Churchill, visited London on December 31st, 1900, where he was a young man on the rise as well. was traveling, visiting Canada, talking about his experiences and his adventures in the Boer War. And there's an article written by Mark Richardson of the London Public Library. And by the way, the London Public Library and the London Room were very helpful in preparing for this interview, and I give them thanks for that. But Sir Winston Churchill, of course, he wasn't a sir yet, he was just a young man. He comes to London, and where does he stay that night of December 31st, 1900, but at the home of Sir Adam Beck? What can you tell us about that home?
It was certainly a mansion. It had been called Elliston before that. It was owned by Ellis Hyman. Ellis Hyman came to London probably in the 1830s. He also was of Germanic background as a tanner. And then he developed a great shoe manufacturing company, and he got into the pork business and spread out well beyond London. Anyway, after he married, Beck purchased this great mansion. It had 16 rooms in it. It covered the entire block. So we're looking at the area from Richmond, St. James Street, Wellington, and Sydenham there. Okay. He was a great horseman, and that's how he met his wife, because she was a horsewoman, and they were both passionate about horses. So what he does is he builds stables on the property for his horses. But I also hire a butler, a housekeeper, a cook, 3 maids, and 2 gardeners to run the establishment. So obviously he was comparatively well off for that particular time in London. But as I said, he earned it. He worked hard, to earn what he did. Yeah.
So when this rising star, Winston Churchill, comes to London, I guess it seemed natural that would be the place he stayed, at the home of Adam Beck.
Let me tell you a little bit about this. He was not the best house gift you could have. In later years, Beck said of him, I begin to wonder who the hell owned the house. Because he was probably bossing the servants around and everything else, because of course he was an aristocrat, and was used to this, and treating people beneath them as like that. So I thought that was an interesting comment, but made by Beck.
Oh, that's funny. Dan, this is great. We're talking about Adam Beck and Sir Adam Beck. We'll get to that in a moment, but we do have to take a break. Viewers, hold on. We'll be right back talking with Dan Brock about Sir Adam Beck. All right, we're back with Dan Brock, a local London historian, talking about perhaps one of London's brightest London lights, Sir Adam Beck. Now, Dan, before the break, we were talking about Winston Churchill visiting the Beck home in 1900. Beck is a rising star. He's mayor, he's MPP, but he always wanted to help the people. He never forgot that that's what a politician should be all about, a servant of the people. So what did he do locally that left a mark on the city of London?
After he failed in his first election, he got connected with the Victoria, what is we now know as Victoria Hospital. He was the representative for the city council on it. And he fought for patients' rights. One of them being, for example, that if people were non-pay or poor, all the students and so on could watch them be examined and so on like that. He thought that was wrong. He argued and won in that particular case. He also got rid of some of the fat, if you will, and other inefficiencies within the hospital. So it ran lean and mean, so to speak, just like he ran his own business, I would say. Now, the interesting thing is that the one big thing we know about him in London is the sanatorium. His daughter was born in, I think it was about early 1900s. And in 1910, she contracted TB, tuberculosis. He had the money, no expenses were spared. He took her to England, to Europe somewhere, to a sanatorium, and she was in fact cured. Both he and his wife realized that that was fine. They had the money to do that, but there were so many people around them that could not afford this luxury. And, and so to help the victims, he advocated the building of a sanatorium here in London. He even donated money of his own, which would amount, I would say, to a few $100,000 in today's money to help to build and finance the sanatorium.
Yeah, young people, Dan, may be surprised to learn COVID has not been the only pandemic that has hit the country. Tuberculosis was a scourge in the 1900s, and 2,000 people in 1 year died from that terrible disease. So he establishes the sanatorium. As you say, he's a fighter, he's an advocate. I don't want to say he's the Donald Trump of his day, but he certainly ruffled a lot of feathers because he was always rocking the boat for a better life for the people of Ontario. And as you say, especially the poor, who many times couldn't afford proper health care and needed their lives, or their lives being in the balance. And he went to bat for them. So he definitely was driven by this desire to help people. And that brings us to our next topic, which is that of bringing cheap, reliable electricity to the province of Ontario, to London, Ontario. Tell us about that fascinating story.
He, at an early point, advocated the making of electricity a public thing. Up to this time, you had various companies, sometimes small, sometimes large, that provided electricity, usually hydroelectricity, locally. They could put dams on the streams or whatever, and but it came with a price, and often it was inefficient. You know, you could have blackouts locally and so on. So he really worked at trying to. He thought if the government owned this or the public owned it, it would make it cheaper for the people. Remember, he always was interested in the people, particularly those that could least afford things like this. And also, just like he ran his own business, it could be more efficient than all these ones that some were working well and some were not.
Maybe I could just share some of the background. So, and this might be hard to believe, but at the time in early 1900s, the main source of power in Ontario and in London was the burning of coal. And I read that there was a strike by the coal miners in Pennsylvania, and Londoners were facing the prospect of a very harsh cold winter without coal. And again, Sir Adam Beck, being a man of the people, caring for the people, didn't think this was right, that we had to rely on others. And he heard about electricity being generated at Niagara. So he went to bat to have public ownership of electrical generation power and bringing it to London, Ontario, correct?
That is correct. And you're quite right that there was a generating station at Niagara, privately owned, and he advocated for taking it over, and then later, wanted generating stations elsewhere throughout the province.
And ultimately, it led to this generator behind me in this photograph. I just have this background of the Sir Adam Beck generating station behind me, which was instrumental in revolutionizing power in the province of Ontario, wasn't it?
It certainly was. And this is the one that is at Queenston, and the water is coming all the way from Chippewa as well. And later on, it is named after him, this huge generating station, which was, I believe at that time, certainly the largest hydroelectric power station in the world.
Yeah, and it's still a marvel, isn't it? People I've read have come from all over the world to see this experiment, this successful experiment that was a radical idea at the time. First of all, the generation of so much reliable, cheap power from the Niagara River, and somehow transporting it all the way to London, Ontario. You hear about the battle between Thomas Edison and Tesla, whether it should be DC or alternating current. And of course, Tesla won out in that argument, and they were able to bring huge voltages of power and electricity to London across those hydro lines. It really is a fascinating story, and one that people should probably look into if they're interested. But what became really unique here is that the electricity became publicly owned. Many places in the States, and you mentioned this to me, Dan, that in many of the states, power is still controlled by private interests and companies that sometimes jack the rates up, and their customers have no alternative but to pay these high exorbitant rates for electricity at times.
So that's quite true.
I wanted to read a quote. Sir Adam Beck, a man of the people, said this about himself. And this is something I'm hoping every politician out there listens to and takes to heart. Sir Adam Beck said in 1913 at a complimentary dinner in London for the citizens, he said, "I am a servant of the people. My greatest joy is to make the lot of everyone within the range of my work and influence brighter and better. I have helped to make the goods of the merchant and the home of the poor safer from fire. I've helped to lessen the cares of the housewife by making electricity her servant. I have my reward if I've done that. If I've helped the farmer to make his life more attractive to the boys and girls on the farm, then I have not labored in vain. If I've helped to save the life of any afflicted child or lengthened the days of any afflicted, I'm happy." He said this, "The day of the people is come. In the winning of these great victories, I am but one, but you are many. Let us set our faces toward the attainment of even greater things." Wow. I wish our politicians today, and I'm sure some of them do, but it seems like many of them, and I don't want to get on a pulpit here, but on the issue of power, people are pursuing their own ideologies, and it's at the expense of the people. We're seeing the price of gas go through the roof. The price of electricity will be going up. Adam Beck wanted to go in the opposite direction. He wanted things to be cheap, reliable, and this was so important to him, and he accomplished that. Now, Dan, we're running out of time. I want to talk about his funeral because we know in 1925, Sir Adam Beck unfortunately passed away. What can you tell me about his funeral?
His funeral was held at St. Paul's Cathedral, and the interesting thing is that the first live broadcast outside a studio was held at that funeral, and it was by the station, the only radio station in London at that time. It is believed this could even be the first out of studio broadcast in all of Canada. So, and this is 1925, August 1925. He was buried in Hamilton because that's where his wife wanted to be buried. Because she had lived there before they got married. And the funeral cortege, which went from the cathedral to the train station, was lined up 8 to 10 people deep. So if we remember the processions for Queen Elizabeth II just a few weeks ago, it was like that. And again, some people were very emotional as the hearse passed them, because he had touched so many people, particularly the working class people, the farmers, and so on like that. The politicians, many of them were not all that happy with him throughout his life and his head-on fights with them, but the ordinary people certainly were behind him.
Right. And unfortunately, Dan, we don't have any video of the funeral. But as you say, it was the first radio broadcast outside of a studio. It almost brings up thoughts or memories of John F. Kennedy when his funeral occurred, and the adoration that the people had for him, lining the railroad tracks and lining the streets, and a very tearful thing that touched the nation. I'm not sure that Sir Adam Beck was quite to that magnitude, but certainly the description you give approaches that.
Yes, his death, he died of pernicious anemia, and his death, as far as the people were concerned, was as unexpected as was Kennedy's. He was suffering, but the people were not aware of how serious his condition was. So this was a real shock. They weren't expecting him to be dying. He was only 68 years old at the time.
Wow, that's amazing. Dan, we're almost out of time. The legacy of Sir Adam Beck, can you sum that up in one or two sentences for me? He's a man we need to remember, perhaps one of London's brightest lights, one of London's greatest London lights. What can you tell us?
Well, one of the things I've read is a quote that basically Beck had seen how potentially rich the province of Ontario was, and he wanted to make certain that private individuals and corporations, especially foreign ones, he was one of these people that didn't want to see the United States, sort of Americans taking over industries and so on in Canada, and this is way back in Ontario at his time. And he did not want to see, them carrying off the wealth for themselves. He wanted it to be left with the public, with the people. And in London, we had a school named after him, and then one beside it named after his wife. He was knighted. The university in 1916 gave him an honorary doctorate of laws. And that's just in London. As we already mentioned, that the great power station that he first built, it eventually was named after him. There are schools elsewhere in the province named after him as well.
Dan Brock?
Yes.
Thank you for being here with us today to talk about Sir Adam Beck. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. Londoners, stay tuned for more London Lights.